Hey Playas, how you doing? Welcome back to Playas Guide. On this episode of Playas Guide, I will be discussing Super Nintendo collecting. This is going to be a two-part series. This first episode, I'm going to start off by discussing different things you would want to know when you're getting into collecting Super Nintendo and different things about collecting Super Nintendo in general, the different games that are out there to collect for, because there are 721 different games, but this goes beyond that. This goes beyond the basic licensed library. There's a lot more to collect out there, and I'm going to talk about that. Next week, I'm going to talk about the rare games, the rarest of the rare, and some of the underrated rares for the Super Nintendo. So subscribe, it's free to do so, you got nothing to lose, and stay tuned next week for that episode. So I talked about how there was 721 different Super Nintendo games in the North American licensed library. There's 517 in Europe, and in Japan, 1,447. That's more than double the North American licensed library. But the great thing about the Super Nintendo is you could play all of those games. You just have to import them, find a cart shell, and replace the board. Just swap the board out and then pop it into your Super Nintendo. There's no need to damage your Super Nintendo and break the pins that prevent those Super Famicom carts from fitting. So when I talk about licensed games released in North America as part of the library, that doesn't include a lot of different things like prototypes. There are prototypes out there for the Super Nintendo of games that have been undumped and unreleased, and they're still out there. Some of them people don't even know about, collectors like you and me. There's also an unlicensed game called Super Noah's Ark, which is pretty rare. However, it's not as desirable as most of the rare licensed games. There's also 14 not for resale cartridges that are clearly indicated on printed labels for the game that say not for resale. Well, there are some out there that have a sticker slapped on them or slapped on the back that they're not for resale. The 14 that do have their own unique labels is Contra Alien Wars, Donkey Kong Country, Donkey Kong Country 3, Ken Griffey Jr.'s Winning Run, Killer Instinct, Mortal Kombat 2, Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Star Fox, NCAA Basketball, Turtles in Time, Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, Stunt Racers, Tetris Attack. I think I covered them all there. So keep an eye out for those. They are clearly indicated that they're not for resale, so it might be hard to find these ones. The thing is if you get lucky and find one, somebody's really got to not know what they have or care, because like I said, they're clearly marked not for resale. The Super Nintendo also had test cartridges. There's a burn-in test cartridge, which seems to be the most common. There's also a Super Scope test cartridge. The burn-in test cartridge does have some different variants out there. There's also a Super Nintendo test station, and these test cartridges and test stations are extremely rare. You're very fortunate if you're able to come across one in the wild or have one in your collection. The Super Nintendo also had a massive variety of different controllers, some of them third-party. There's some weird-looking ones out there if you're into different oddities. Not quite as many as the NES had, though. The NES almost seems like endless, because when you think you know about them all, there's always some other weird controller out there that you find out about. Now, the Super Nintendo only had two models that I'm aware of, two major, models that had differences, and that was, there's the Super Nintendo, the, original one that we all know, and then there was a mini console version which is a bit harder to come by and more collectible. Collecting for the Super Nintendo right now, it's a very popular system, but I feel like the market is fairly established and might even cool off a little bit in the next little while. So it's not a bad time to get into it. I don't anticipate any giant, jumps in price for a lot of the games. Maybe some of the underrated rares, but I'll get into those next week. And I'll talk about all the rare games you need to know about if you're collecting or want to collect for the Super Nintendo. Until then, later, players.